I love old superheroes. I've read every single modern issue of JSA. My second favorite Marvel team, after the Thunderbolts, is the Invaders. There's just something really, really charming about a lot of those characters from the super early days of the genre. I'm not entirely sure what it is. If you asked me to place it, I probably couldn't. And since, of course, there are a lot of characters from that initial boom period in the 1940s, a lot of them did end up in the public domain. I want to talk about some of those characters because I think it's interesting. Now, pretty much every character I'm going to talk about here today is in the public domain because the company went under and nobody bought the rights to them. Two characters did make it out of these companies that I'm going to talk about. The first is Dan Garrett, the Golden Age Blue Beetle, who is partially in the public domain. I will get to that later. And the second is potentially Phantom Lady. I was not aware of this until I started making this video, but this character has an extremely complicated rights history. I am not going to go into that. That is a subject for another day. Some of these characters may be owned by someone, but those copyrights don't really seem to be enforced. If one of these characters calls to you, you can probably use them, but for some of them you might have to be a little careful. Now, there are a couple things I'd like to talk about real quick. The first is that I am going to be talking about the companies. This is mostly just to establish a little bit of extra context around the characters. Secondly, some of these scans will have pretty variable quality. Some of them might be a little bad. When you're dealing with public domain obscure comics from the 1940s, that's just kind of what happens. As for those scans themselves, I am primarily getting them from the Digital Comic Museum, which is a big database of a bunch of public domain comics. It, along with every other non-Wikipedia source I used, is going to be linked in the description. I would like to say that I did pick the characters before I did the reading. If they had less than 10 issues, I read everything they appeared in. If they didn't, I read their first story, anything that was supposedly of note, and a few random issues to round it out. I am not going to be talking about every issue I read because at some point they start to blend together, they tend to be fairly similar, and it wouldn't be very interesting. If there is something weird, I will mention it though. Finally, a couple disclaimers. The first is that a lot of these comics were published in the 1940s or the 1950s. If I mention a character that is not white, you can be pretty sure they are racist. I am not going to be showing a lot of the racial depictions, but you can be rest assured that there are quite a lot of yellow peril and anti-black racist stereotypes in this. If you go back to these on your own, do not say I didn't warn you. I also feel like I should mention that a lot of these have to do with the Second World War. If you are sensitive to topics relating to the Second World War, like with racism, this is probably not the video for you, and you should probably go find something else to watch. I'm sorry. That is happening at this time, and a lot of these characters do get involved in it in some form. With all of that out of the way, now let's get to the actual topic of the video. Up first is Standard Comics, which had two lines: Better Comics and Nedor Comics. These were originally separate lines, but they got merged in 1949, spelling the end for many of their characters. Eventually, though, things got even worse, and in 1956, this new unified line ended, and a bunch of their titles went away, with 3 remaining in publication by a different company called Pines Comics, who also picked up a few books from another company called St. John Publication. Pines then either went out of business or was sold alongside the owner's other company, Popular Library. The rights are a little hard to figure out from here, but they're probably in the public domain by default. Popular Library's stuff is currently owned by a French company called Hachette Livre, as there was a chain of sales and acquisitions. First, they got sold to Fawcett, then to CBS, then to Warner, and finally to their current home. If these characters' legal rights lie anywhere, it is probably there. One of the more notable public domain characters of the time is the Black Terror. He's actually had a pretty decent resurgence over the years, being one of the more recurring public domain characters, if not outright the most recurring one. He first appeared in Exciting Comics 9 in the middle of 1941 and would consistently appear in comics published by Nedor through the end of the decade. He had a self-titled book and was a regular feature in a couple of others. He had a decently big presence at the time. Also, some of his comics were apparently written by Patricia Highsmith, who was a notable novelist. The Black Terror himself is a pharmacist named Bob Benton. After getting shaken down by some gangsters for some protection money that he doesn't have, he interferes in the gangsters' threatening of a kid that they physically run into. They punch Bob and leave. The kid introduces himself as Tim Rolland, and Bob hires him on the spot. He also meets his future love interest, Jean Starr, who is the mayor's secretary, here. Later that night, Bob is experimenting with some chemicals. Tim is also there and gives him the wrong chemical. This results in him making a more potent chemical formula, the vapors of which give him superpowers. Those superpowers are just kind of the generic set, if that makes sense. He's super strong, he's durable, he has enhanced speed, that thing. He decides to use these powers to deal with his protection money problem and fight for justice. Jean and Tim also happen to be there. Also, Tim got himself a costume when he went and got Bob's. He would become a sidekick later. I don't think he ever gets a superhero name, but collectively, Tim and Bob are called the Terror Twins. The two would then go on to have a lot of adventures. This is stuff like stopping illegal meat dealers or figuring out a murder case where the perpetrator is a Nazi saboteur who is pretending to be a blind fortune teller with a parrot, and the method of murder is that the parrot will peck people and its beak is poisoned so they die. As a character, I think Black Terror and Tim are alright. They're decently fun, if nothing special. Pyroman is another one of Nedor's more prominent characters. He would first appear in 1942 and, like Black Terror, would last as a prominent part of their line all the way through to 1949. Pyroman, despite his name, has nothing to do with fire. He has electrical powers. He gets these because he's a student researching electricity. His name is Dick Martin. His friends get involved in an insurance scam, which is actually some attempted sabotage by Nazi operatives, the leader of which is named Disaster. His friends eventually realize that he can implicate them in the arson, so they attempt to kill him by sabotaging a dynamo he's working with. Dick survives this, and it's not revealed until a little later, but this is what gives him superpowers. I'll explain those in a moment. Then, eventually, he goes to the site of the group's second arson and gets framed for murder. He gets sentenced to the electric chair. This is what leads to him learning about his superpowers. The way it's described is that the negative volts from the dynamo absorb the electricity from the electric chair, giving him powers, which, sure, I guess. He then uses these powers to break out of prison and track down Disaster. He finds one of his dying friends there, and he goes and fights Disaster again, who escapes. Mildly confusing name aside, I do actually quite like Pyroman. Miss Mask is a pulp-esque hero, very much in the vein of characters you may be a bit more familiar with, like the Green Hornet, or the Spirit, or the Wesley Dodds iteration of Sandman. Her secret identity is Diana Adams, a wealthy young woman who deals with crime using guns and detective work. As far as I can tell, she never got an origin story. She's not terribly unique and doesn't really have a whole lot to her character, but she is fun. She didn't really appear a whole lot, and I don't have a whole lot to say about her as a result. Debuting in the Fighting Yank 7, the Grim Reaper primarily works behind Nazi lines during wartime as an unpowered but costumed saboteur and assassin who leaves calling cards after everything he does. Most of his stories deal with that setup. His origins are told in Wonder Comics 2. He is an exchange student named Bill Norris who is in Paris when it gets occupied. He opts not to leave and then immediately gets arrested for interfering in a beating of a man. He gets sent to a concentration camp. There, he befriends an old man who's a prominent part of the French resistance. The comic specifically says he's the leader. The man passes on the location of a general in hiding before dying as a result of a beating he endured in the camp. Bill escapes with this information and manages to get the general out of the country. After the war ends, he would return to the United States and become a more conventional superhero. Honestly, I did really like a lot of the stuff I read from him. It was pretty simple stuff to the point where I don't think a lot of it is quite weird enough to talk about in this, so I'm going to kind of leave that out, but it was generally pretty fun. I could very easily see this character as prime real estate for an interesting modern reimagining, and I would read Watch Whatever that reimagining. Fiction House is a fairly obscure publisher, and fittingly, I only have one thing from them I'm going to talk about today. They weren't really a big superhero publisher. Their most notable character by far is Sheena, Queen of the Jungle, who is, I believe, the first woman to have her own self titled comic book. And that type of thing is pretty emblematic of their output. Stuff featuring conventionally attractive women on the covers and in the stories. They just kind of stopped doing well around the time Seduction of the Innocent was released, causing a moral panic about comic books. The decline in sales as a result ended in Fiction House closing up shop. My first and only Fiction House character for today is White Panther. In case it's not obvious, the entire reason I am talking about this character is the name and concept. White Panther has two appearances, the second of which is a reprint of the first one. White Panther comes from a book called Jungle Comics. To probably nobody's surprise, this book contains racist depiction of South Africans. Anyway, White Panther is from a secret white tribe in Africa. In his singular adventure, he helps a doctor who is trying to find some rare healing stones to make medicine. At least that's what I think he's going to do with them. It's not exactly clear. Anyway, he ends up saving the doctor from some evil people who also want the stones for unclear reasons, and some cannibals. Those cannibals are the racist part of this particular story, by the way. Anyway, they find the stones and a cave-in happens. White Panther, the doctor's daughter, and the leader of the evil people all survive and leave. There, they encounter the cannibals again and get on a raft. The evil leader jumps into the river and gets eaten by alligators. Never mind that alligators do not live in Africa. Thus ends the single adventure of the White Panther. There is no appetite for another one from me or any other. By far the most enigmatic company today is Centaur Comics or Centaur Publications or the Comics Corporation of America. These are all the same company, by the way. They are the end recipient of a chain of sales of publishers like Ultem Comics and the Comics Magazine Company, and they would go out of business by 1942. There's not really a whole lot on them, and what there is doesn't align between the sources I can find. Airman had about 4 appearances in the Golden Age. The first of these is in Keen Detective Funnies 23, which is the second to last issue of Keen Detective Funnies. He's just kind of a winged guy that lives in a cliff with a laboratory. He's Drake Stevens. He's the son of a bird scientist that got murdered. This inspired him to become a superhero. In his second appearance, he gets a jetpack in addition to the wings. He also mostly deals with nautical stories. Of his 4 Golden Age stories, all of them involve him dealing with some sort of boat-related plot. It could be pirates, it could be fraud, it could be drug smugglers. He's also just kind of bad at superheroics. He crashes into some paint cans for no reason once, and Then another time, he just doesn't even bother to look for a trap and just activates a tripwire. This character just kind of sucks. The Phantom of the Fair was a very early superhero. He first debuted in July of 1939, which is a couple of months behind the Wesley Dodds version of Sandman, a character he is very connected to you. Some of you might already have some gears spinning in your head and be connecting the pieces, but I'll get to how and later. Phantom of the Fair is first introduced as a mysterious protector of the World's Fair in New York. He's kind of vaguely powerful with enhanced strength, probably durability as well, and agility. He's also pretty sneaky and has all sorts of trick escape routes all around the fair. He might also be magic. His first story has him attempting to solve an attempted murder at the fair. He threatens torture. He's also stated to probably have been around for at least 1,000 years. Following that debut story, the Phantom of the Fair would just kind of go on solving issues at the fair throughout the rest of his tenure. This includes stuff like a, and I quote, prehistoric ape that runs wild. In his last appearance, he was renamed Phantoman since the World's Fair had ended by that point, but as far as I can tell, this is his only appearance under that name. As for that Wesley Dodds Sandman connection I mentioned earlier, that is that he would be revived as a villain by DC Comics on 2 separate occasions. The first one was pretty quickly post-Crisis as the antagonist in a revised version of Wesley Dodds' origin story. And the second time, this one a spin on the first, would be in Sandman Mystery Theater. Here he is depicted as a repressed and abused gay man who murders other gay men. This character is kind of nonsense, but in an endearing and sort of stupid and fun way. Also, I feel like I should mention that in his second appearance, he shares an issue with a debuting character called Speed Centaur, and I think that's magical. I'm talking about this next character, Magician from Mars, for one simple reason. She's one of the first female superheroes. She predates Wonder Woman and a lot of the other earliest superheroines by a bit. She only had 5 appearances. Magician from Mars is Jane 6EM35, although in her second appearance her last name would change to the far more normal Q-X3. She is a child born to an Earth woman and a Mars man. This story dubiously takes place in the future if it's not obvious. She gets exposed to a cathode ray, which causes her to develop superpowers due to her heritage. In the second issue, these are described as her using 100% of her brain. These powers are very vaguely defined, but she is absurdly strong, immortal, and ageless. She can just kind of do whatever she wants. She breaks into a safe and steals a lot of gold, and then she donates half to charity after helping to save a rocket, keeping the rest to costume herself. She goes to Earth in the process of this, and just stays there for most of the rest of her stories. She also has an evil aunt who is set up to be her arch nemesis, but never really does anything interesting. This is all stuff from her debut story. If this sounds poorly paced and a little hard to follow, it is. Most of her stories are weird, but like bad writing weird. The dialogue is really bad. The plots are also weird and meandering. Like, sometimes they mostly just feature her wandering around and doing things for a page. It could also be just a super short story where she fights an elemental. They do kind of improve as they go, but they aren't ever great. There's also even some attempts at some serialization in the last one, but that just kind of falls flat because it never gets a follow-up. The character, finally, is also just kind of boring. There's nothing going on there, and there's nothing going on around her. There's no named character, and the only recurring one is her aunt, who appears in her first and last stories. She's just kind of generically perfect with nothing going on. The stories are not strong enough to carry her. I do not like the Magician from Mars one bit. I am not surprised the character didn't last. I'm just surprised she lasted so long. The Eye is a little later of an edition, and I'll admit it doesn't quite fit with the topic of the video, that being superheroes. But it is a funny enough concept that when I came across it while reading stuff for other characters, I just had to talk about it. The eye is a giant eyeball that is, and I quote, well known to the Afghans. As for what the eye does, it just kinda has overwhelmingly strong powers and does whatever it wants. Its debut story has it crashing a plane and also telling an old man exactly what to do to get a guy who wants to kill him and abduct his daughter arrested. That sort of thing, more specifically advising someone on what to do and then doing something wild to the antagonists, is its shtick. I love the eye. There's something so amusing about this character. I think just the fact that it's just a giant eye that flies around and acts as an all powerful force is so dumb and it's so charming. It's great. Fox Feature Syndicate is one of the longer lasting publishers on here. Early on, they lost a court case to DC Comics over a character named Wonder Man, who was created by Will Eisner. He was found to be a Superman knockoff. He'd only appear once, and that's kind of the only interesting thing about him, so consider that a bonus character. Anyway, they had a publishing hiatus between 1942 and 1944, but aside from that, they just kind of kept limping along until about 1950, where they just kind of became bankrupt. That's probably the best. They would probably not have survived Seduction of the Innocent. They had a lot of crime comics and a lot of comics with sex appeal. They did own Phantom Lady for a time, so that's kind of expected. They also, and I just have to mention this because it's insane, published the most unhinged comic ever released. It's called Hoot Gibson's Western Roundup. What this was them buying back unsold issues and then repackaging those issues with an issue of Hoot Gibson Western 3 as a new comic. Part of this practice included taking off the cover page of each issue. That is a problem because the stories would start on that first interior page. So this is a comic that is 3 random issues and an issue of Hoot Gibson Western 3 that is, aside from the issue of Hoot Gibson Western 3, missing its first pages. On top of that, those issues are random. It's just 3 completely unsold issues that they could find and staple together. This is a real product that was sold for money. I'll admit that this is a little hard to verify. The comic is very obscure, and what issues exist do appear to be wildly expensive and not go on the market very often. As far as I can tell, the most recent sale happened in 2013. I do believe this is a real thing that happened, though. Some of this information, a lot of it actually, traces back to Boyd Maggers, a man who has written a lot of books about westerns and appears to have a copy. I am inclined to trust it, but your mileage on this may vary. Fox Feature Syndicate is also where Blue Beetle originates. Dan Garrett is sort of a public domain character. You just can't call him Blue Beetle because that name I'm pretty sure is trademarked, and you have to spell his last name, Garrett, with 1 T. You also can't use the Scarab because his Golden Age origin is different. He is almost certainly the most famous public domain superhero. During the company's publishing hiatus, he was published by a different publisher I will briefly talk about later. They also sponsored a Blue Beetle Day at the 1939 World's Fair for some reason. Okay, man. After Fox went out of business, Charleston took over the publication and introduced Ted Kord as his replacement. Charleston was later bought by DC Comics, who fully owned the rights to the Ted Kord and Jaime Reyes versions of Blue Beetle, and also the name Blue Beetle. Again, Dan Garrett kinda isn't fully owned by them and is sort of public domain. People have used him in things, but it's not terribly common. The Flame was one of Fox Feature Syndicate's bigger titles, first appearing in the middle of 1939 and appearing consistently until the company eventually ran out of money. Notably, he was created by Will Eisner. His backstory, revealed 9 issues after his debut, is that he's the son of a missionary in China, specifically Yi Chang if you're curious. During a flood, his parents attempt to save him, but die. He ends up in a monastery of some sort. It's not explicitly stated to be Buddhist, but it probably is. He eventually becomes the leader of the monastery, trains, and learns magic, but eventually leaves when missionaries arrive and recognize a picture of his father that he has. Before he goes, one monk teaches him fire magic. Gary Preston, which is his real name, gets a lot of things from those powers. The big one that I like is the ability to teleport via fire. That's a pretty unique thing in the superhero genre, and I think it's pretty cool. He pairs this with a flame gun, which is basically a small flamethrower combined with a flare gun. He's also got other fire-based powers and some ill-defined magic that also includes other stuff. I cannot think of an example of that being used, though. In the last 3 issues of his run, he got a sidekick, Flame Girl. She's his girlfriend, Linda Dale, who has taught his powers. I think he's interesting. He's got some stuff going on that I think could be explored in an interesting way in a more modern context. The Green Mask is actually 2, technically 3 separate characters. The first Green Mask debuted in Mystery Men Comics 1. This issue has him and a reporter, who is the only person who knows his identity, dealing with a life insurance scam by gangsters. He continues doing stuff like this until he finally gets an origin. He gets that origin in Green Mask 1. Michael Shelby is the son of a senator who wants to introduce a law that gives the death penalty to all gang members. A law that will surely have no negative consequences whatsoever and is totally fine. The senator gets assassinated by a group of organized criminals who don't want this to happen. Michael gets injured in the assassination attempt, and a doctor uses a special machine to heal him. This gives him superpowers. This includes flight. As far as I can tell, before this he was just a random guy in a costume, and this is when he got his superpowers. Anyway, he used these powers to find the group of criminals and stop them. They want to destroy the world. He also gets a sidekick, Domino, in this issue. He's a homeless kid who just kind of gets caught up in the fight between Michael and the criminals. He uses a boomerang and just kind of runs around and complicates things. A couple of years after the first Green Mask's last appearance, the second and third Green Masks appear. They both appear in a relaunch of the first Green Mask's solo book. The new version is Johnny Green, the 15-year-old son of presumed widower Walter Green, who is off at war and also now the original Green Mask. This identity is dubiously public knowledge. Johnny is a nerd who lives above a social club and survives on occasional checks containing his father's pay. One day, some gangsters kill the owner because he didn't want to purchase illegally brewed alcohol from him. They also kill an employee Johnny is friends with and Johnny's dog. This makes Johnny so angry that he transforms into the Green Mask and goes to stop them and get revenge. And it turns out both the employee and the dog are fine. We also learn that Johnny has no memory of his transformations. The 3 Green Masks, I don't have a whole lot of an opinion on them. They are certainly characters that exist. Lev Gleason Publications is a comic book publisher founded by a man named Lev Gleason. Now, I would like to start before I get into this is that a lot of this comes from a relative of the man. This company is a little hard to find information on. This relative did write a biography. That biography does not have great reviews. I have not read it. A lot of this is coming from an article he wrote. Take this with a grain of salt if you want. This is coming from a guy who is related to the man. Anyway, the company at some point possibly purchased Silver Streak Comics and Daredevil Comics from another publisher, but it also might have launched them themselves. What is notable, though, is that it did launch Crime Does Not Pay, which is one of the first big crime comics. Lev Gleason himself was apparently generally connected with left-wing movements in the United States. He was a member of the Communist Party in the 1930s, for example. His company published various things related to left-wing politics in addition to the comics. Both this and the prominence of crime-based comics in their catalog resulted in a decline in sales in the middle of the 1950s due to the moral panic caused by Seduction of the Innocent. He apparently attempted to testify in front of Congress about comics in an attempt to stem the losses the backlash would cause. Despite that, the Comics Code authorities rules for what could be in comics would eventually result in the company going out of business in either 1955 or 1956. There does seem to be a little bit of confusion about the exact year. There's also a new Lev Gleason publications that publishes stuff occasionally, including that biography of Gleason. I don't know much about them, but they do exist. Captain Battle debuted in Silver Streak Comics 10. He also had a solo title very briefly, and there's also a 2-issue Captain Battle Jr. comic that follows his son. He is a World War I veteran who has lost an eye, and with the help of his secretary Jane and his equipment, which consists of things called Dissolvo, a ray gun that dissolves things, a curvoscope, which goes largely unexplained in his debut story, but lets him see things all over the planet, and the Luciflyer, which I'm pretty sure is his jetpack. He fights, and I quote, evil and aggressive influences. In his debut story, this means giant immortal bird people called Diagolos, who are invading Europe and are commanded by a sorcerer who is also behind the Axis powers. Captain Battle dissolves them, but can't do it fast enough and gets captured. Black Dragon, the sorcerer, attempts to transform him into a Diaglo, but Captain Battle just leaves. This is the start of a 3-part story. I am not a terribly big fan of Captain Battle. I think he's very boring. He's honestly kind of just there. I think that nonsense of that first story would be much more interesting with a more interesting protagonist. No discussion of Lev Gleason characters is complete without Daredevil. This character is one of the most prominent in this video, if not the most prominent outright. This character had a very long run. Charles Bureau wrote his self-titled book for 70 issues even. And that wasn't even the end of it. The book would continue on for about 60 more, ending with 134 issues. This book is interesting because it also started in a similar way to Captain America, having the main character fight Hitler before the US was formally involved in the Second World War. I think the story is interesting, if not terribly great. It's very of its time in an interesting way. He's honestly not even really in a lot of it. It's mostly about how he and Silver Streak get some intel that affects the British war effort. I'll be talking about Silver Streak. That's a different character. I'll talk about him next. This is followed by a story about him fighting the Japanese, and that story also features a prominent early supervillain, the Claw, who is a Yellow Peril character. I'm not going to be showing him for obvious reasons, but that character was so prominent he actually got his own stories in the anthology where Daredevil debuted. There's also a third story in that issue where he fights Hitler and some Nazis in Africa, but that one's not that interesting. You'll notice that so far I've barely talked about the character himself. There's a couple of reasons for this. The first is that his name and origin did change. His debut name and origin from Silver Streak 6 is changed in the 18th issue of his self-titled book. But in both appearances, he is a fearless, athletic, acrobatic man who uses boomerangs as a weapon to stop crime. In his debut issue, he's Bart Hill. His dad was an inventor, which ended up getting him and Bart's mother killed. The criminals that do this brand Bart with something shaped like a boomerang, causing an obsession. In his first appearance, he might actually be mute. There are certainly texts suggesting as such, and he doesn't say anything. I think it's a rather unique trait of the character that gets abandoned before anything interesting can be done with it. In case you're curious, that does mean it's gone by his second appearance. I think that's a shame, but I'm not entirely sure it would have been handled well at the time. It gives a little extra something to a character that's just kind of a Batman knockoff. Although I do think it is kind of funny that Matt Murdock might not even be the first superhero named Daredevil with a disability, even though Bart lost it later. In his retconned origin, he's now the son of a man who owns an Australian gold mine. His uncle attempts to steal the mine from his father, which results in his father and mother getting killed by racist depictions of Aboriginal Australians. Those Aboriginals end up raising Bart until he's 13. Then he just kind of ends up back in New York where his uncle attempts to kill him and fails, breaking his own neck in the process. Honestly, I think this is a character that has a few interesting or good ideas that aren't executed well due to the time they were published. I think this character has a lot of potential with both origins, and someone talented could really do a lot with either one or even mix the two. The Silver Streak is a character with a truly wild origin. Debuting in Silver Streak Comics 3, his first story starts with a race car driver being killed by a giant fly. This is not him. He is a cab driver who offers to drive the car that race car driver was driving, which is not confusingly also called Silver Streak. Nobody else wants to do this because the fly has been a persistent problem for them and it just keeps killing the driver. He also gets hypnotized by a Swami into being braver, believing he's called the Silver Streak and making him better at driving. The cab driver, who I feel I should mention never gets a name, is killed by the giant fly. Then he gets dug up by the Swami, who praises Allah, which is a little odd considering Swamis are Hindu, and also the guy who owns the car is there. This is because the Swami thinks he's just in a hypnotic trance. He is, of course, correct. Silver Streak wakes up and is declared to be all-powerful. This just means he can fly and is super fast and also stronger than a normal person. Meanwhile, the fly is causing havoc, even leaving a ransom note. Silver Streak swears revenge and, stealing the car, goes to fight the fly. He throws the fly into space. Then it's revealed that the fly was an attempt to get rich, and the story continues. His second issue is just him doing stuff while trying to track down the guy who makes the giant bugs. We do learn he has suction shoes here, and also he becomes a superhero off-panel. Later, he would get a pet falcon with superpowers and one, possibly two, sidekicks. Occam's razor says that it's one, and the name just changed from Mercury to Meteor between issues, but you really never know. This character's a little insane, and it's very fun. Crime Buster is a younger superhero who debuted in Boy Comics 3. He's one of Lev Gleason's more prominent characters. He's pretty much just an average boy of indeterminate age. He's probably a teenager, though, and he went to military school. His name is Chuck Chandler, and after his journalist father is murdered by a Nazi operative named Iron Jaw, he learns his mother's been abducted. He travels to France to bring his mother back to the United States. When he leaves his hockey game, taking a cape with him. This is what becomes his costume. He also gets a monkey while he's traveling. And then eventually he gets to France, he meets his mother, and they get on a boat back to the U.S. That boat gets torpedoed by a U-boat, and his mother dies in the attack. He and his monkey live, and get swept up by a passing plane, causing Chuck to swear revenge. He would continue publication until Lev Gleason Publications went out of business. The character, visually at least, did have a little bit of a presence in pop culture afterwards because a slightly edited version of the character's costume appears on the cover of a Rage Against the Machine album. He's a fun little character. Not exactly to my tastes, but I can see how someone would like him a lot. He's got a recurring antagonist right off the bat, which is pretty unique for even notable characters of the era. Sure, Ironjaw doesn't last terribly long and has a very anticlimactic death at the hands of some other Nazis, but the immediate plot out of the gate is pretty unique among the stuff I've read for this, and I quite like it. Reading the serialized storytelling was honestly a little refreshing after reading a lot of repeated episodic stories, some of which would even change major details between issues. And, because I want to talk about him a little, Ironjaw would go on to reappear in the 1950s. He gets smuggled into the US as a South American mummy. Then he becomes a masked wrestler as part of an operation to squeeze people for money. He wrestles Crime Buster and attempts to kill him. Then he joins up with some communists in the hope that he gets a chance at Crime Buster. Eventually, after that, he joins a group of supervillains. That is where his status quo ends because that's when the company goes out of business. I think he might be the most recurring villain in the entire video. It's either him or the Claw. Novelty Press was a comic book publisher founded in 1940. In 1949, the company would sell its assets to artist L.B. Cole, who would launch a company of his own, Star Publications. From there, they would pivot into horror comics, although they did publish other genres such as romance and crime. This would ultimately be very bad for them, as the near death of horror and crime comics in the middle of the 1950s, as a result of the moral panic caused by the seduction of the innocent, would strongly and quickly affect their bottom line. They would shut down in 1954. Also, as a fun fact, they might have been the first comic book publisher to have a letter column. They'd existed prior in other things, but this is, I believe, the first recorded use of them being used for a comic. Blue Bolt is an interesting one, if only for some of the names that worked on it. Jack Kirby started working on it starting in issue 2, and that does mean that Blue Bolt was worked on by the same creative team that made Captain America, since Joe Simon was the writer for issue 1. This team would then be on the book until issue 10. Anyway, Blue Bolt is Fred Parrish, a Harvard football player. He and a couple of teammates get caught up in a storm, and the other two, who aren't ever really given names, are killed by lightning. He then attempts to go and get help by flying a plane out, but that plane gets struck by lightning. It crashes, and he ends up getting saved by a group of advanced subterraneans. They give him a treatment that does something with the charge of the lightning and radium, and this gives him superpowers. It's just kind of the generic set of superpowers, and he also has a lightning gun. Fred is then told about his archenemy, the Green Sorceress. She is a powerful magician, skilled in black magic, who wants to use the radium used to heal Blue Bolt to take over the world. Very consistently, she does in fact think he's handsome, which is a bit of an interesting wrinkle, I guess. Once the war started, he would return to the surface to join up in the military. He would also eventually lose his own book, as it was converted into a horror book. Don't despair, though. He had a very long run before this happened, being about 100 issues. He had a good run, but personally I'm not really all that into him. I can see how someone could be, but none of his stuff ever really gripped me. It's not bad, but it's not for me. Target first appeared in the 10th issue of Target Comics. His two sidekicks, the Targeteers, first appeared in the next issue. That first issue starts with the Target running newspaper and radio ads announcing his existence and that he's going to start going after criminals. He also does stuff with phones and telegrams to get that information out. Then some criminals pull a job and he interrupts them. He is just an athletic guy with a bulletproof costume. That is his power set. He wears a target on his chest because it supposedly causes people to shoot at it. This is a contender for the dumbest thing in the video, in my opinion. He also uses darts as a weapon, which is pretty cool. In his second appearance, he and the Targeteers get a backstory. Target is Niles Reed, an orphan alongside his older brother Bill. Bill, a DA, gets accused of murder, gets convicted, and then is sent to the electric chair. It is stated that he is innocent. Niles breaks him out, but Bill gets shot during the getaway and dies. Niles buries him and goes back to the city, where he immediately encounters Tommy and Dave, two teenagers who were orphaned by crime. He takes them in, they become friends, and they become the Targeteers. Starting in the 29th issue of Target Comics, which is called Volume 3, Issue 5, because Golden Age numbering makes no sense, they join the military. Each one joins a different branch. Niles joins the Army Air Force and goes to the Panama Canal. Niles joins the Marine and participates in an invasion of a poorly defined part of Japan. And Dave joins the Navy and goes to the West Coast. This continues on for a bit, and I shouldn't have to tell you, these stories, I can't show you a lot, they've got racist stuff. They would go on to have an 85-issue run. Target Comics itself would end with issue 105, but their last appearance was in issue 95. And I think these guys are alright. Holyoke Publishing is a little odd. The rights history here is a little complicated, but to make a long story very short, it was a publishing company that purchased the rights to a few other characters. This section of the video is honestly kind of just characters made by a guy named Frank Temerson, who is a video all on his own. These are characters that came from his companies before Holyoke and would go back to another one of his companies post Holyoke. Calling this section the Holyoke section is a little wrong, but calling it the Temerson section isn't quite right either. Holyoke would end up going out of business sometime in the late 1940s. Wikipedia says 1948, but Wikipedia also dates some publications after that. Temerson would get the rights to the titles they'd purchased from him back in 1943 and would have several more companies through to the end of the decade and possibly as late as 1950. In case you're curious, this is also where Dan Garrett ended up during Fox's publishing pause. Catman is a bit of an odd one. He's a weird mix of Batman and the various Tarzan-esque jungle-themed characters that were popular at the time. He also has a sidekick, Kitten, who is herself a very blatant spin on Robin. Catman, real name David Merriweather, has two origins. His original origin from his debut in Crash Comics 4 is that he's the son of a family in a mystery jungle. Some places say Myanmar, but I'm not entirely sure where that comes from, who are all killed by natives. He is left alive and found by a tiger, who raises him. This gives him cat powers. This is basically more agility, the ability to emit light beams from his eyes, enhanced vision, and 9 lives, although one of those lives doesn't make it past his debut story. Anyway, that tiger brings him back to humanity, and he makes his way to the United States, where he is outraged by injustice and becomes a superhero. His second origin comes much later, in Catman Comics 27, which is 5 issues before the book ended, by the way. In this origin, David's mother is a renowned animal tamer who specializes in big cats. One day, she gets shot, leaving him with the cats, who he is already bonded with. Here, he's raised by a group of leopards. In the present, he goes to a circus with Kitten, another hero featured in the books named Deacon, and Deacon's sidekick. There, he encounters one of the leopards again, as well as the man who killed his mother. The leopard mauls that man. The man did it because he thinks big cats should be free in the wild instead of in circuses. The book frames this as a bad thing, by the way. As for Kitten, his sidekick, she would be introduced in Catman Comics 5. She's an orphan named Katie who's currently in the custody of her criminal uncle. They attempt to rob David, but she tackles her uncle, allowing David to knock him out. Before this, she and her parents were acrobats, but her parents died in a train crash. She accidentally finds a spy ring and, while David's in the process of fighting them, assists a little and learns about Catman. Then she makes her own costume and declares herself his assistant. Kitten also gets retconned in the big Catman retcon. Now she's named Rosetta and was found in the leopard cages. She got renamed Katie when David adopted her. Apparently he'd become a member of the army at some point. It's definitely happened by the time Kitten debuts, but I'm not entirely sure when exactly it happened. I feel like I should also mention that there is an Australian version of the character that is a little different. But overall, I think Catman is a little goofy, but that's more than fine with me. He's not the most interesting thing in the world, but he's serviceable. I think Kitten is more or less the same. I like her a little more than him, but it's not a huge amount. Miss Victory is a pretty strong contender for my favorite characters this entire video. Her name is Joan Wayne. She's a stenographer in the offices of the Secretary of Commerce. At the time, this would be Jesse Jones, but she works for someone named Mr. Mason. She's never really given a backstory, but in her third story, we do learn that she's from Ohio. Her powers, if she has any, are similarly vague. She's shown to be strong and quick and acrobatic and tough, but none of them really seem all that superhuman. Her first appearance has her dealing with some corrupt figures who are attempting to change a trade deal. That's just kind of it. Her second story has a caption that calls her a Holocaust while she fights Nazis. This caption, in case you don't know, would age in a very interesting way, as the at the time ongoing genocide was not termed that quite yet. She mostly just does stuff like this for a bit, dealing with attempts by Nazis to do things at the Department of Commerce. Later, she transitions into a Navy pilot role, pretty much without warning or reason. She gets very racist during this period, by the way, and there's a very clear change in the creative team. She gets a new, more revealing costume, and the stories get worse. I think the costume was a little before this. Its debut story doesn't really fit into either period, but it sticks around for the status quo change. The change is very obvious in the small details, and the big ones, frankly, but there's stuff like early Miss Victory making her dislike of guns pretty clear, and then her later appearance she just starts using them. There's also stuff like her losing her glasses in her civilian life, and also just being very bland. Not helping this is the fact that her last couple of stories are post-war, so she just starts fighting criminals, and she keeps the plane and the guns and the blandness there. I read, I think, everything she appeared in. I enjoyed most of it quite a bit. I'd say that the early comics are worth reading. Just stop once her costume changes. Also, in case you're curious, she does indeed fight a Nazi ape in an issue of Captain Arrow Comics. Unfortunately, there's not really a lot out there about the last publisher I want to talk about today, the Columbia Comics Corporation. Really, all there is that it was founded in 1940 and then went out of business in 1949. It's basically everything I could find. Skyman is a bit of a funny case, notably because he's not even the most notable character named Skyman, arguably. There's a very obscure DC Comics character named Skyman. He's a member of Infinity Incorporated and is currently dead. Anyway, the Columbia Comics Skyman debuted in Big Shot Comics and would feature somewhat regularly in comics published by the company, either Big Shot or a 4-issue self-titled book that was released over the course of about 7 years through the entire company's lifespan. He started as a sort of cross between a superhero and another type of hero pretty common in Golden Age comics, in case you didn't notice. That is aerialists. He flies a super advanced plane and has a bunch of other high-tech gadgets. He uses these to go on adventures, such as him going up against Doringa Saboteurs, which is his entire first and second appearances. In his third appearance, he gets a love interest. She's a private detective named Fawn Carroll. She operates her own agency. She would appear in his stories sporadically. Skyman is notably sexist toward her. I actually like the idea of her more than her characterization. I think that if this character got revived, she could be very fun with a much more modern point of view on her, because she doesn't really get to do a lot. He also gets a name in that issue. He's Alan Turner, a playboy with inherited wealth. This later gets expanded into a full origin story. I am going with the one from Skyman 1 here. His father was killed in a plane crash, no mention of what happened to his mother, and he goes to live with his uncle, a professor at a prestigious university. He stays there and he learns and he becomes an athlete, etc., and then eventually just graduates from that university. This is actually where he first meets Fawn, and they fall in love pretty quickly. There's not really a lot to this. His uncle does become a supporting character after, though, so that's fun. Wikipedia says he got a flying cape in 1944. I did read some stuff after this, most memorably a story involving giant Martian rats, and I'm not entirely sure if this ever got used in any of them. His stories in Big Shot, including the Martian rat one, do become serialized pretty quickly, so that's fun. I don't think this character is really anything special, but in the right hands, I think he could be a pretty fun character. Debuting in the very first issue of Big Shot Comics, the Face is another one of Columbia Comics' most recurring characters. As far as I can tell, he was never given a backstory. He was given a name, though. It's Tony Trent. He is a radio personality who dons a fearsome mask that scares everyone who sees him. He uses this to solve crimes. For example, His debut story has him taking on a crime boss who donated poisoned turkeys to an orphanage. He's also giving other people who need food aid exclusively flour and apples. He gets money to do this, buys the cheapest things possible, and then pockets the rest. Eventually, he would demask and continue on as a feature under his own name. This feature would end with Big Shot Comics. He's fun in the same pulpy way a lot of the pulpier characters are. I like him, but he's nothing special. I don't really have a lot to say to conclude this, so I'm just going to run down a short list of a few more things I wanted to say. The first is that I do think this is a subject ripe for an anthology book. Bring back a bunch of public domain characters in like short stories. I know I would buy a copy of that, although I don't know how many other people would. This is also not anywhere near an exhaustive list of even all of the characters published by just these companies. There's a lot more, and there's a lot more companies. You probably write a very interesting essay looking at a lot of the ways a bunch of these and other stuff portray American anxieties about World War II and how they pivot once the war actually starts. It is something that was very obvious to me, but I am not particularly interested in talking about myself. But that's a free idea. You could really do something there. I've also kind of started putting together another installment of this because I enjoyed it and kept running into characters I wanted to look a little more into. In the interest of time, I decided not to do that. I've also kind of started putting together ones about characters under the DC and Marvel umbrellas. And most importantly, an entire other video about Fletcher Hanks comics. This is because Stardust the Super Wizard was originally supposed to be in this video, but it was too insane and I couldn't do it justice in this format. So I am definitely doing that, and all the other Fletcher Hanks characters.